Hey guys, it's Mr. Wessner. We are back to keep going with Pennsylvania history, and we're starting a new chapter today. So today we start chapter 2 in our Pennsylvania history books. And chapter 2 is all about the European arrival in North America and how things progressed during that time. So it's a period of time called the colonial period. And we'll talk about what that means as we go through this chapter. But we'll be talking about the arrival of Europeans. So I want to start out by showing you some of those first people to arrive in Pennsylvania. Here they are. Now, they look a little different perhaps than what you maybe are used to or what you're expecting. This is a long time ago. A lot of times when the folks look at these pictures in the classroom, they want to know, why are they dressed like that? Well, it's kind of like somebody in 400 years saying, oh, why are they wearing those weird looking hats? Or why are there symbols all over their shirts? We don't know what fashion's going to look like 400 years from now. But 400 years ago, the time these folks were living in, this is kind of what the fashion looked like. It's what was popular, it's what everybody was wearing. So that's kind of the reason they're dressed like that. There's some really interesting personalities here that we're going to be reading about as well as we go. So let's jump right in. In your ebook, this is page 22. It's called Explorers and Early Settlers. Okay. So our three vocab words here are explorer, settlement, and colony. Okay, so those are the terms we're going to be learning about as we go through these next few pages. Our vocab strategy here talks about the word explorer, and it focuses on that suffix, that ER suffix. And hopefully you already know this, but if you have ER on a word, it means it's a person who does something. So a teacher is a person who teaches. Doctor ends with that sound. It's a person who takes care of you, even though doctor is spelled with OR. Helper, a person who helps. Thinker, a person who thinks. So that ER ending can mean a person who does something. So here, explorer is a person who explores. And what does explore mean? Well, it's traveling. It's discovering new things. It's learning about places and things that have never been discovered before. So to explore. Our time period here is the time period from 1609 to 1681, and there it is on our timeline. So this actually overlaps that time of the Eastern Woodland Indians that we talked about in the last section, where our Eastern Woodland Indians were 500 years ago to 300 years ago. Well, 300 years ago right now was 1720, so this time period 500 years ago right now would have been 1520. So we're kind of right in the middle of that time of the Eastern Woodland Indians. So just realize that the Eastern Woodland Indians are still here during all of what we're going to be reading here in this next section. Okay. Our Build on What You Know says, when you go to a new place, do you bring something from home to make you feel comfortable? Europeans who came to Pennsylvania brought their culture and customs with them. Okay? So they brought things that they were used to, but they couldn't bring a lot of extra stuff. When you were packing these ships, these big, tall ships, they were called tall ships because they had tall masts with big white sails. And as you were packing those ships, you had to account for every pound of material. You needed a lot of food. You needed fresh water. So you had to bring barrels and barrels of supplies and equipment and things you would need to begin your life in this place thousands of miles away from home. So you couldn't bring a lot of extras. You couldn't bring like the little stuff that you may really like. But if you think about it, when you go on a vacation, when you go on a trip, you take that stuff from home. Maybe you take a favorite pillow along, or a favorite stuffed animal, a favorite video game system, whatever it happens to be, handheld system. So all those little things to help your trip be a little maybe less boring, maybe a little more comfortable for you. Those are the things you take along. And that's what they did, except they couldn't take stuff. So instead, they brought their ideas, they brought their cultures, they brought their beliefs. And those ideas that came with them are part of what eventually shaped the ideas that started our country when they established the United States about 150 or so years later. Our first main heading here is Europeans reach North America. And the main idea here says that people in Europe began traveling to North America and present-day Pennsylvania about 500 years ago. Now, that's not entirely accurate because there were people from Europe that had been here actually about 500 years before that. Some of the first Europeans that people believe arrived in parts of North America were the Vikings. So there were Viking explorers who arrived in parts of Canada and explored northern Canada and eastern Canada about 500 years before these Europeans arrived. So there's some debate and some argument about who was first and when the first people really came here. Never mind the fact that we already found out that over 10,000, 12,000 years ago, and possibly even longer when we looked at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, we had people migrating here from Asia. So we're talking about more modern Europe, more modern European cultures. And of course, 500 years ago, or a little over 500 years ago, was when Christopher Columbus set sail. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So 1492 is when Columbus arrived. And he never came to North America. He never came to our country in what would be considered the mainland United States. But he came to the islands in the Atlantic Ocean, known as the West Indies, and he traveled around those islands. And that's when he realized, oh, he found some land here. And the reason they were called the West Indies, the reason the native people became known as Indians, is because he really thought he was in India or in the islands off the coast of India. There's a lot of little islands in the Pacific Ocean as well. So he thought he was in those East Indian islands, and he really was not. So that's kind of the idea there. But that's what it says here as we look at the first paragraph. European explorers began traveling to North America in the 1400s. An explorer is a person who travels in search of something. Some explorers were looking for new routes to travel to other lands. Others were looking for valuable goods such as silk and spices. So why were they coming here? A lot of times we think about why do people come to America? Well, they're coming for freedom. They're coming for new opportunities. Well, eventually that's true. That's probably true of your family members who traveled here, maybe from other countries in the early 1900s or late 1800s. But when we're looking at these folks in the 1400s and 1500s, why did they come here? Well, they wanted to get rich. They wanted to get famous. Okay? They were looking to find new places that had never been found before. And the reason they wanted to find those new places is because maybe there was something there they could take home and sell for lots and lots of money. And they mentioned valuable goods such as silk and spices. Well, those were things that were available in an area of Asia, places like China, places like India. They had these fancy fabrics made of silk. They had spices they couldn't get anywhere in Europe. So those things were worth a lot of money because that stuff didn't grow in Europe. And so we don't really think of those as especially valuable today because they're easy for us to get. We go to the grocery store and we buy a bottle of spices. But back then, that wasn't the case. You couldn't grow that stuff in Europe. So if you could imagine eating all your food without any salt, without any seasoning, without any flavoring, so having those types of things was very, very popular among the wealthier folks in Europe. And so people were willing to pay a lot of money to get those Asian spices and those Asian fabrics as well, those lightweight, flowy silk garments and things. So that's what they were hoping to find when they sailed, when Columbus decided he was going to sail off to the west, hoping he would end up east of Europe in Asia. So that was that whole idea. And it's a myth that Columbus or that everybody else at that time thought the world was flat. Most people by then knew the world was round. They had observed things like eclipses to see the shape of the earth or shadowed out on the moon. So for the most part, scientists and other people that followed science like Columbus would have known that the earth was round. Over time, more explorers began to travel to North America to claim land or find wealth. Others came looking for a place where they could practice their religion freely. And that's where we start to get into some of those freedom ideas. We'll talk more about that in our next lesson when we start talking about William Penn. But the first people were coming looking to get rich, and then later people were coming for other reasons, such as finding a place where they were allowed to believe in the religion they wanted to believe in. The first explorers probably set foot in what is now Pennsylvania in the 1600s. So it was about 100 years after Columbus's first sailing, and actually a little over 100 years, that the first people actually started to arrive here in Pennsylvania. And that took some time. After Columbus went back to Europe and talked about what he discovered, then for other people to start to save money, collect resources, get ships together, get all those things going on. It was throughout the 1500s then that explorers started to come here, and then it wasn't until a little later that they ended up as far north as Pennsylvania. There were explorers in other parts of the country at different times. So they think it was probably around 1600, and we're going to find out who that explorer was here in just a moment. Okay. Explorers in Pennsylvania on page 23. In 1608, an Englishman named John Smith became one of the first explorers to come to present-day Pennsylvania. Now, you may have heard of John Smith before. Okay? If you're a Disney fan like I am, there is a Disney movie that features John Smith. And John Smith is a pretty common name, but John Smith in a Disney movie looks like that. Okay? John Smith. Okay? Very handsome man. Now, John Smith was also on that first page I showed you. So here's real John Smith. And again, here's Disney John Smith. Why would Disney make him look so different? Well, nobody's probably going to buy tickets to see that guy in a movie. Sorry. Okay? But this handsome Disney prince will sell more movie tickets. So it's important to realize that sometimes Hollywood changes history. Hollywood finds a good story in history, and they like to take that story and they like to make it even better for a movie so that more people will be interested in it. So always do your own research. Always do your own background information. Find good sources. Find good authors that have studied a time period. And look into it yourself if you're curious about a historical event that was portrayed in a movie. And some movies do a better job than others, of course. Some movies try to be very, very true to what happened in history, and others take more liberties. In fact, John Smith isn't the only character that Disney changed the look of a bit. Here is the beautiful Pocahontas from that same movie, who sings one of my favorite Disney songs. I love Colors of the Wind. That's a great Disney song. But there's Pocahontas, and here is real Pocahontas. Okay? So again, they changed the look of the person to fit what they believed was a more appropriate idea of a Disney princess, or a more popular, more marketable idea of a Disney princess. So be aware of the fact that movies sometimes change our history to suit what they're trying to do, to suit their purpose. We talk about author's purpose in ELA. Well, it's the same idea. When a movie producer, a movie director, a movie studio is making a movie, their purpose is to convince people to see that movie so their movie makes lots of money for their studio. So that's the idea there. The other thing about Pocahontas is her and John Smith in the Disney movie are about the same age. Okay? In real life, that wasn't the case at all. Pocahontas, I believe, was about 12 years old, if I'm not mistaken. They estimate that her age would have been about 12 years old when the settlers first arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. So, and John Smith was in his 20s, I believe. So a very big age difference between Pocahontas and John Smith. And they were not in love. It wasn't a romantic relationship between them the way it's portrayed in the movie. But some of those things in that movie are true. There were settlers that arrived in Jamestown. There were some conflicts with the native people who were already here. They were called the Powhatan Indians. So there were some problems between them, and they were resolved, and they did eventually agree to live together peacefully. So some of those things did occur. Pocahontas actually ended up moving back to England after the events of Jamestown. So as the settlers arrived in Jamestown, Pocahontas agreed to go with them back to Europe. That's actually when the portrait I showed you was made. And I believe she died very young. She died in, I think, her early 20s. A lot of times when when European settlers came to North America, they brought diseases from Europe that the native people had never been exposed to. So their bodies didn't have any natural immunity, and they often didn't live very long if they became ill with some of those diseases from Europe. Okay, let's get back to the book. So page 23, if you're following along in the ebook, and it says, in 1608, an Englishman named John Smith became one of the first explorers to come to present-day Pennsylvania. Smith had helped set up a community in present-day Virginia in the early 1600s. When the community needed food, Smith left to find it. He sailed on the Chesapeake Bay and up the Susquehanna River. He met the Susquehannock Indians there. And I'm going to put my map, I think, up here behind me. And there is a route, and I'll try to show you here as well. Okay, but there's a route there, and they're traced in different dotted lines. If you're following along in the ebook, this would be a little easier to see. But John Smith left the Chesapeake Bay, or left the Jamestown colony in Virginia, sailed up the Chesapeake Bay, and that would take him right up the Susquehanna River. So he was looking for food. So John Smith was the first European that they believe arrived in Pennsylvania. Okay. In 1609, the Dutch hired an English explorer, and that gets a little confusing. The country where Dutch people come from is a country called the Netherlands in Europe. Okay? So Dutch folk live in an area called the Netherlands. In 1609, the Dutch hired an English explorer named Henry Hudson to find a direct water route to Asia by sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. So they hadn't given up on this idea yet. They hadn't given up on the idea that if they sailed to the east or to the west, they could end up in Asia. And the reason that was such a popular idea, well, we're going to need to go to Google Earth again here and to some other maps. So let's do that. Okay, so that's kind of why they needed to find that path to Asia. They needed to find a way to get there that was maybe a little safer. So that's what Henry Hudson was hired for. Hudson was hired to find a direct water route to Asia across the Atlantic Ocean. Although Hudson did not find such a route, he did explore the Delaware Bay. His voyage made way for later Dutch explorers in this region, such as Cornelius Hendrickson. By 1623, the Dutch had set up a trading post in the Schuylkill River area. So the Dutch were among the first people to actually settle and decide to stay here in Pennsylvania. Even though John Smith came here, his colony, his settlement was in Virginia. So it was the Dutch who decided, oh, this is a good spot to maybe stay. This is a good spot to settle. So they built a trading post along the Schuylkill River that flows into the Delaware River near where Philadelphia is today. And I think that's where we're going to stop today. There is one other thing I want to show you, and it's a brain pop video about Henry Hudson. So we'll take a look at that, and then we'll wrap up with this part of Lesson 1. Okay, so we are going to take a quick look at a video from Brain Pop that explores a little bit more about the life of Henry Hudson, not only the things he did here in Pennsylvania, but some of the other exploration he did of the eastern coast of the United States, including exploring parts of New York and Canada. So let's take a look.
Sure you want to go that way? Dear Tim and Moby, I've heard the Hudson River was named after some guy called Henry Hudson. Who was he? Thanks, Olive. Henry Hudson was the greatest explorer who never found what he was looking for. He was born in England sometime in the late 1500s. Back then, before planes or trains, people traded goods by boat. Traveling by sea could take forever, especially if you were going all the way to Asia. Silks and spices were worth their weight in gold, and the Far East was the only place to get them. Many people set sail to find these items during the Age of Exploration. This was a period when European explorers searched for trade routes, land, and riches. Reaching Asia by sea was cheaper and safer than the old Silk Road route. But many explorers believed there had to be a faster route than going all the way around Africa. so they turned their eyes west. They knew that since the Earth was round, if they sailed far enough west, they'd hit China. Right, in 1492, Christopher Columbus ran into a teeny tiny little problem with that plan. But the promise of a faster route to Asia didn't die there. More than 100 years after Columbus, Henry Hudson was determined to find a way. Between 1607 and 1610, he led 4 voyages to try and find it. Everything we know about Henry Hudson's life comes from the journals he kept during those voyages. Nope, we don't know when he was born, or much else about him. That portrait of him? An artist made that up. We have no idea what he looked like. Well, let's just keep showing him how everyone else does. In 1607, Hudson convinced some English merchants to pay for a voyage to Asia. His idea was that he could get there by sailing north through the Arctic Ocean. Nope, they hadn't even reached the Arctic Ocean before icy conditions forced them to turn back. But Hudson convinced the same group of merchants to pay for a second mission. They made it a lot farther this time, but there was just too much sea ice. After this failure, Hudson lost his English backers. He turned to England's biggest trading competitor, the Dutch. Specifically, the Dutch East India Company, the largest company in the world at that time. They agreed to finance his third voyage and gave Hudson a ship called the Half Moon. But as they were sailing through the Arctic, you guessed it, ice. This time, Hudson hit upon a new plan. Instead of sailing northeast, they would go northwest. See, back then, most of North America hadn't been mapped by Europeans. Many thought there must be a waterway leading all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They called this mythical route the Northwest Passage. Hudson's new plan was to be the first explorer to find it. He led his crew down the American coast, sailing into the mouth of a river. The Mohican people who lived nearby called it the Mahicanatuck River. Today, it's known as the Hudson River. This time, he was sure he'd found the way. Hudson didn't discover the river. The Mohican knew it well, and other Europeans had been there before. But Hudson was the first European to sail as far as he did. Still, about 150 miles in, the water grew too shallow to continue. When Hudson returned to Europe, England's King James I made him an offer. Leave the Dutch East India Company and find the Northwest Passage for England. Hudson agreed and set out on his 4th voyage in 1610. Seeking another entrance to the Northwest Passage, he followed an inlet into northern Canada. In July, they reached a huge body of water, now known as Hudson Bay. They spent months mapping the coastline, but couldn't find a way west. And then winter set in. Hudson Bay filled up with ice, blocking the way out. The crew was forced to drop anchor and stay for the season. Many of them blamed Hudson for their predicament. It took until the following June for the ice on the bay to melt, and by then the crew was starving. Some were convinced that Hudson had a secret stash of food. So, even though they were heading home, the crew mutinied, rebelling against their captain. They forced Hudson, and those still loyal to him, onto a small boat. None of them were ever seen again. Okay, so Henry Hudson never found his way to Asia. And wasn't even the first European to find the Hudson River, or most of the other bodies of water that carry his name. But his third expedition brought the Dutch to the New World. They settled along the Hudson River and founded New York. England started colonies along the East Coast. These eventually became the United States. Later on, they used Hudson's last voyage as a basis to claim land in Canada. Today, Henry Hudson's name can be found on schools, bridges, towns, and waterways. In fact, there's more water named for Henry Hudson than for any other person in history. If you really want to.
So I hope you enjoyed that closer look at Henry Hudson with Brain Pop. I thought it went well with some of the things we were discussing in class about Hudson, and as well as some of the other explorers like John Smith and Cornelius Hendrickson. Just kind of shows you what that life of exploration would have been like. And that